uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jabari.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jabari, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. I want to welcome everyone to the Liberian History channel right here on Focus on Liberia. And this is a continuation of our series on the presidents of Liberia. Today, we're going to be focusing on President Anthony W. Gardiner. That's Anthony William Gardiner. He's the 9th president of Liberia. As usual, we have our presenter, Carl Yeye. And today we are happy to be joined by another Liberian from Grand Bassa County. Is that right? Right. I want to welcome our friend Jabari Lamb. Jabari, welcome to the Liberian History channel. How are you?
I'm doing well, and it's great to be back on.
Right, we had Jabari. Jabari, before we start, just let's talk about a little bit about BAIO. I know you were here before, but this time in a different capacity. We are discussing the presidents of Liberia. A little bit about yourself, Jabari. Jabari, go ahead. I want you to tell, and you can tell us about your Liberian roots from. Did I put you in Sino or Grand Bassa the last time?
You didn't pick me anywhere, so I guess Grand Bassa is where it is. I think if Grand Bassa is where it is, it's where it is.
Right, and that's why we are discussing Gardiner, your fellow Liberian from Grand Bassa County. But Jabari, welcome. We are glad to have you. The last time you were here, we were talking about your organization, the BAIO, and we are happy to have you back discussing presidents of Liberia. Just a little bit about yourself and your group.
Yes. So, of course, our organization, I did an interview with him earlier, but for the viewers who are new, we are the Black African Infrastructure Organization. We are dedicated to strengthening the connection between African Americans and other members of the African diaspora with Liberia. We plan to go to Liberia in the future. We've always had our mindset set there, and we're planning to continue to do more great work through education, news. That's what our organization is all about. And we are also the only other organization that has done a Liberian presidential series, although it's a little bit more brief. So if you want a brief synopsis of the Liberian presidents, we have done a Liberian presidential series all the way up to Alfred Francis Russell. We are on the way to doing Joseph James Cheeseman and Hillary R.W. Johnson. Now, Hillary R.W. Johnson was before Joseph James Cheeseman, but those are the next two presidents that we will be doing on our Liberian presidential series for those who want a more brief overview of the Liberian presidents.
Thank you, Jabari. I thought it was important that you say that. And for our viewers, Jabari was here before, African American, who has this deep interest in Liberia. As he said, his organization is trying to establish that link. And if you want to establish a link between Liberia and United States, Africa and the United States, where's the best place to go than Liberia? So Jabari is here. Thank you so much. And he has his own channel where he's doing the same series, the president of Liberia, very in a brief form, as a brief form of the president of Liberia. So he thought it wise to join us here today and also be a part of this very important series. Let me welcome our chief presenter. So Jabari will be presenting also with, he's a co-presenter with our chief presenter here, Carl Yeye. Carl, welcome.
Yeah. Every episode, Dennis, I have to say this.
It's better than yours, but I don't know why I can't get this right.
I don't know, maybe. Yes, so let's say. Jabari. It's such a pleasure to have you on here to present with me. I absolutely adore this young man. He is a curious mind with a lion heart and, courageous points of view, someone who thinks for himself and presents information through the eyes, ears, and mind of an African scholar, an African-centered scholar. So he has my respect as a student of history like myself. And like I said, there's not much else I could say, but it is a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to doing this. What's going to happen is I'm going to start with the kind of the background. I'm going to talk a little bit about, like I always do, sort of the brief history of the president, why he went to Liberia, and then I'll turn it over to Jabari to present on the details and highlights of President Gardiner's presidency. Of course, we can't cover everything in 2 hours. So Jabari is going to cover some of the things that he thinks are important, and I agree with him that are very important to present. And then he will close with kind of a reference, a bibliography of places that you can go to find out more about the topics he's discussed.
Thank you. And Carl, if you can shift a little bit on this side.
This way. You know how this is, Dennis. I'm not all the this way. Okay, got it. Everything's reversed on the camera, so you gotta. Okay, I think this does it. Perfect.
That's very good.
Okay.
All right. And so once again, Jabari, welcome. I want to welcome our viewers from across the globe. This is Focus on Liberia. This is the History Channel. That's the Liberia History Channel. This is the only place you have the Liberia History Channel anywhere else in the planet. And we are very thankful to Jabari, who is doing a good job on this channel, covering Liberian history and other things. And I watch your Presidents of Liberia, the series, very brief. And I like it, And I continue to say on this show that when I went to school in Liberia, most of us, we did not do anything in-depth on the presidents of Liberia or the history. So what we did was to memorize the list of the presidents. Until this day, I learned that in grade school. I still remember. If you want me to do that, I can do it right now. But for the sake, so that was just a rhyme. And so this is very, very important that we discuss this. And so we want to go right into it. The last time we were here, we dealt with two presidents who had their second term. They were president once, and then they came back to be president again. Yes. So this time we are going to I believe he's the 9th president of Liberia. That's Anthony William Gardiner. Call.
Yes. So President Gardiner is, not written about that I have found as well as he should have been. Considering everything that he's done, I haven't found as much material on him as I would have liked. However, what I have, what we're going to present today is, again, a brief synopsis. This is what Anthony William Gardiner actually looked like. And you all know from watching the last, 3 or 4 episodes that a lot of times we were going off of sketches that were done in the 1950s, long after these men had passed away, to see what they actually look like or imagine what they look like based on artists' renditions of them, artists who never actually saw the presidents. And these, unfortunately, are the sketches that are kind of ingrained in the minds and hearts of Liberian people. However, many of these presidents, from the very first president, Roberts, were photographed. And so as much as possible, we are going to share actual photographs of the presidents or earlier sketches that existed during their lifetimes to reflect what they actually looked like. So far, every single president that we have presented, with the exception of Daniel Bashir Warner, we have presented actual photographs of. With President Warner, we're able to provide a sketch that was available at the time that he was alive. So it was more credible because if you are a living person and there's a sketch representing your likeness, it's probably more accurate than something that was done in 1952. In this particular case, this is what President Gardiner actually looked like. And he was, of course, our 9th president. He was in office from January 7th, 1878 and he left office with a voluntary resignation on January 20th, 1883, due to a prolonged illness. And I want to emphasize voluntary resignation. This is the height of patriotism. When you're sick and unfit to serve, you resign and turn over leadership to someone who is stronger and more capable. He wasn't, he was, of course, 1820 was when he was born, so he wasn't really that old when he got sick, but this is, the 19th century, and a lot of times people were not as strong, as healthy, and didn't have the kind of health care. So at that age, at that relatively young age, he became frail and incapable of continuing the process. So I just wanted to, kind of put that out there. Next slide, please.
And Cole, before we go to the next slide, I have a confession to make. This is one president I really never read about at all until we started this series.
Okay.
And the little I read was like, wow, why did I? And I can't really put a finger on why. Maybe I was too busy with the sciences and didn't have time. And I've always liked to use myself as an example of, Liberians, how little we know about our presidents. And some part of it is we really didn't care. It's like, to many of us, it's like Liberia started with President Tubman. And so every other thing before that is like, I really didn't see much of eagerness or an interest in studying these people. So even before we go to the next slide, Jabari, what really sparked your interest in studying the presidents of Liberia and doing something about it?
So in basic, what inspired me to study the Liberian presidents was that I wanted basically to imagine a curriculum. If I was to give students, high schoolers, college, what information would they be given about these presidents? And that's what really motivated me to say, let me go do a presentation research on each Liberian president, not just a brief overview of them, but their inauguration speeches, stuff that was written in the African Repository, stuff that was written by the Liberian Herald, so that I can get actual codes, actually what was going on at that time, actual photographs or events that were happening at the time when Anthony W. Gardiner was president and was superintendent. And so that's what really inspired me, because a lot of people don't know, and there's not a lot of information unless you really deep into this and have been studying this for years. You're not going to know a lot about Anthony W. Gardiner. You're not going to know a lot about Alfred Francis Russell. You're not going to know a lot about them. So that's what really inspired my interest in to say, hey, let me do each Liberian president. And it's shown the fruits and labors of it.
And Carl, I want to promise you, if you went in the street today and said, tell me which Liberian president voluntarily resigned, I doubt it if you ask 100 persons, if you can get 10 that would tell you is Gardiner. I didn't know that until very late.
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate. The suppression of Liberian history. We talk about this a lot, and the treating it like it's some kind of sacred or secret even knowledge that people are not supposed to access readily, has led to really low self-esteem of the average Liberian citizen. If you don't have anything to be proud of, you don't know how rich and incredibly profound our history is, you won't have anything to kind of, the theme of patriotism in every country is rooted in its history. And so without that, patriotism is shallow, it's superficial, it's based on things that are not tangible, like your ethnic group, the language your people speak, things that are not really rooted in reality. And so when you want to destroy or conquer people or weaken people or subjugate people, the first thing that you do is to destroy their history, erase the memory of their past, or belittle it. And this is exactly what has happened to Liberia. The belittling of our history, the treating of our history like it's something cloaked in shame that we should look down upon. has broken the spirit and the self-esteem of the country to such an extent that the average person on the streets of Liberia, when you ask them anything about the country, they respond to you with such contempt for the past, as if our history began with war or oppression, and not the triumphant stories of some of these heroes. And I appreciate what you're doing, Dennis. This platform, for me, is an opportunity to share with the public why I love Liberia. And it's not just because, my parents are Liberian or I'm Liberian, but it is because it is truly the greatest country in Africa. The oldest, the greatest, the most incredibly innovative. Liberia is the trailblazer for the modern African states. We have not attained the vision of our ancestors yet, but we will, and we will not do it unless we know what that vision was. So part of this process is unveiling what it is that we're striving towards and reminding us that we are a continuation of a legacy that is so old. We have one of the oldest flags in the world. We have one of the oldest national anthems in the world. We have one of the oldest governments, continuous governments in the world. We need to understand what that means. We have a lot to be proud of.
Thank you. So the president today we are starting is Anthony William Gardiner, the ninth president of Liberia. He was in office January 7th, 1878 to January 20, 1883.
Yes. And so President Gardiner, the picture on the left is the one that most people are familiar with. And this is a photo that was sketched. It's like a restoration of a photo and it's, in a sketch form. It was created around 1950. So this is important. This is something that was created around 1950. Now, Gardiner, as we all know, died in 1883. So whoever sketched this didn't see Gardiner, didn't know Gardiner, may have based it on a photograph, but to me, it makes him look much different than he actually looked. And I found that a lot of those 1950 sketches of the presidents are completely off. And most of the time, in fact, all of the time, they're made to look much whiter or lighter skinned than they actually were. I don't know what the motive is. I don't know what the style that would, justify doing this, but it creates a impression upon the minds of young people that see these images that these presidents were the sons of white men and they were very different from the general population. And it just creates a false impression of who these people were. And yes, some of our presidents were very light-skinned. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, especially Russell. Russell was the lightest skinned president we had. His hair was of a much looser texture than that of Roberts. But we need to tell the complete story. And so Gardiner is one of those that his actual photograph appears far more African than the artistic portrayal of him in later years.
And Carl, this is becoming a repeated theme now that these presidents are they are sketched in a different way to make them look different. Does this happen anywhere else? Let's say you also study American history. You study other you read about other people. Is it unique to us, or that was what was going on at this time?
Interestingly enough, in American history, African Americans are not usually sketched or depicted differently from how they actually were. You don't see Harriet Tubman being portrayed as a mulatto woman. You don't see that happening in the Caribbean with their heroes. You don't see that happening. It's happening in Liberia, and I believe, and we've talked about this in the past about what the motive may have been. Again, you're talking about the 1950s. This is occurring. Early 1900s, especially, becomes exacerbated in 1950s, where you have African countries vying or fighting for liberation. You have two places on the continent that are liberated. That are basically self-governing, and that's Ethiopia and Liberia. And what was the excuse that they used in Ethiopia? It's like, these people are not really Negroes, right? They're Caucasoid Africans or white Africans. as these pseudo people would describe it, the people with the agenda to suppress African liberty, would tell them that these Ethiopians, Amharic people are in charge. They're not like you. You know, they're Black Hebrews, or they're, you know, they're Caucasoid. They're something other than Negro. And in fact, the Black Ethiopians are not the ones in power. It's these you know, sort of white Africans who are ruling Ethiopia. And then they would go to Liberia and they would say, well, Liberia, here are the sons and daughters of slaves, you know, self-governing in Africa. And they said, no, Liberia isn't like you. These presidents and leaders of this country before Tubman were all the sons of white men. Before, you know, E.J. Roy. In fact, even E.J. Roy was depicted as a very light-skinned person in the 1950s. So they created this narrative that the only people that were able to govern themselves were people who were light skinned. So they brought this concept of colorism into play, and it's unfortunate. And that this again is my understanding of it in the context of world history. Could it have been just an innocent mistake repeatedly with every president? It's possible, unlikely but possible. And I'm less concerned about motive than I am with the effect of it. Whether intentional or not, the effect of it has created an unfortunate disconnect between the general population and these people. And it makes people to believe that there was absolutely no diversity, that there was this big color divide, that there was light skin versus dark skin. It simplifies, it creates this kind of buffoonish, simplistic narrative of our history, which is false. If you read, you know, the arguments and the different opinions of various leaders, they had very deep-seated ideological beliefs that had absolutely nothing to do with the hue of their skin.
Thank you.
And that is something that Liberians are constantly, it's pounded in their heads. There was a divide between the Republican and the True Whig Party, and it was a basic division based on the color of your skin. That is buffoonish, that is simplistic, and is dehumanizing. And it is not the truth. The fact of the matter is, there were very Black members of the Republican Party, full-blooded Africans, like Stephen Allen Benson and Daniel Bashir Warner. And there were light-skinned True Whig partisans. In fact, the lightest skinned president that we've ever had, which was Russell, was in True Whig Party. And he, you know, so the whole narrative doesn't match. It doesn't match the historical facts. So we have to dispel this narrative and give us our dignity back, our complex humanity back, by telling the correct story.
Yeah, thank
I'll
you.
just say briefly before you before we get to the next slide, is it also, when you have just sketches, it kind of makes you feel sad because there's no actual photographs. When you see a sketch, it's a sketch. I mean, yes, it gives us a view of what they look like, but to see an actual image means something completely different. Whenever I saw a Liberian photograph, I would instantly like save it, because it was so valuable to me, and it was so important that I always had access to these photographs. They did it not just with Anthony W. Gardiner. Look at how they do Garrison W. Gibson. I mean, you look at that man, the way that they sketched him, he looks an absolute disaster. But when you look at him in an actual photograph, it's like he looks nothing like what he's in that actual sketch that they portrayed him.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And let me add a few comments here. Numba Gumbu Palace is very educational. Thank you so much. And I said something, somebody said, yes, my psychology is my first time to know President Gardiner resigned. Thanks. And talking about photograph, Jabari and Carl, Millionaire May is asking, why can I find his photograph online? I can't seem to find it. Where can I find it online?
Okay, I'll put it online for you. Would you like me to put it online so you can Google it? I mean, a lot of these things are in books, right? And so the reason they end up online is because someone scans it and uploads it. So I can upload it for you if you need to find it online. But it really, everything that's online is put there by people, or, you know,
Yeah, I was
So,
gonna say you really gonna have to look through all these books and archives to find it. It's not a one Google
yeah, I
search.
wish I could have just Googled and found a better picture of all of the people that I found, but it took a lot of work. One of the things I will tell you though is if you go to the Library of Congress website, there are pictures for actual, Augustus Washington took many, many photographs of our leaders in the 1850s. So go to the Library of Congress website, it's free, and then, look for Augustus Washington photographs that he took, and you will see Stephen Allen Benson, you will see Joseph Jenkins Roberts. So, there's photographs, but, as far as some of these that we've had to find, it has been digging through a lot of material.
Right. So let's go into a little history there, Carl.
Yeah, so this is just a quick synopsis. Again, Gardiner was born in Southampton County, Virginia on January 24, 1820. He went to Liberia with his family on the brig Vladder's Company, which was a ship. Arrived in Monrovia January 12, 1831. This year is very important. This was the year of the Southampton insurrection, or what we call the Nat Turner Rebellion, which occurred the following August. I don't know why that 89 is in there, but it occurred the following August of the same year, 1831. So there was a lot of upheaval. His parents were followers of the Reverend Nat Turner. Nat Turner was speaking radical liberation theology to free Blacks and enslaved people. And so they wanted to get rid of these free Blacks. They were putting them on ships. They said, these guys are serving as a beacon of hope to our enslaved population. We've got to get these people out of here. So between, I'd say about 1827 to 1831, they were just the ACS. It was like Maryland and Virginia were just shipping free Blacks to Liberia during that time period between 1827 and 1831. We had the greatest concentration of people from this area being sent. And mainly because, again, they're into this liberation theology. These are the African people in America with a mindset that they are human beings, full-fledged, self-determined people. They are inferior to no one, and they deserve the God-given right to self-determination. This was dangerous. Something that we take for granted was extremely dangerous at this period in time. So anyway, he became the first Attorney General of Liberia. He was one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, and then afterwards became the first Attorney General of the country. Served from 1848 to 1855. And then again, as I said earlier, he resigned on January 20th, 1883 due to a serious illness.
Dennis,
so we'll get into more detail during Jabari's presentation. Go ahead.
I would also like to add briefly, and to understand the context of the revolutionary spirit that was happening in the 1830s, what many people do not know is Virginia and Maryland will always have the largest free Black populations anywhere in the States. The North does not have the largest free Black population. Virginia and Maryland will always have the largest free Black populations from the 1790s to the 1860s. And Virginia and Maryland are going to also comprise the major bulk of those that would immigrate to Liberia. Even Nat Turner's own father, Benjamin Turner, would migrate to Africa in the 1830s.
That is correct. Excellent point. And so the migration period was much longer, as Jabari pointed out. The concentration, the heavy concentration, occurred when you have these liberation preachers like Reverend Turner, who later led this massive rebellion, really pumping up people to stand up for themselves. It became a danger to the established society.
Wow.
So, as Jabari had just pointed out, you have this mass removal of free Africans, of free African people. I don't know why there's an S there. Of free African people. Forgive the typo. I actually did this slideshow and didn't really have time to correct it. So there's a mass removal of free African people from Virginia and Maryland during this period. And this is an actual sketch of a vessel that was going to Liberia from Virginia. And I find it fascinating. we talked about Daniel Bashir Warner building ships, and then someone had said was, well, where did he get the engines for the ships? Well, these ships didn't have engines. Slave ships didn't have engines. You know, this was not, the steamship technology hadn't come yet. And here's what the typical ship, they were vessels that were sailed. They operated with masts and sails, and they took a very long time to reach Liberia. So this is important to note.
Wow.
So these are not the ships that you're thinking of. This is not a cruise ship. These are not this is what ships look like in the mid and early 19th century.
Like a boat. So we see.
Well, yeah, the difference between a ship and a boat is really in size and capacity, tonnage. So here we have the manifest of passengers, right? And again, this is on the brig Vlador. If you notice, Gardiner's name was spelled differently on the manifest of the ship. They just spelled it Gardiner, Gardner. And Gardiner, we always talk about the mortality of the family members of these presidents. Well, Gardiner was fortunate that by 1845, really, he had only lost one family member, which was his younger brother, Alfred. And Alfred died at 7 years old upon arrival from fever. Again, tuberculosis and malaria were the two big killers at that time. So they, you know, fever typically meant malaria, consumption typically meant tuberculosis. So Gardiner's brother died, but his other brother, Jesse, survived, at least to the 1845 census. Anthony, his mother, Catherine, and his brother, John, at that point. I mean, his father, John. I'm sorry, I said his brother. His father, John.
Right. John
and
was
if you
35.
notice, as you go ahead.
No, I said John was 35, Catherine was 26, and Gardiner was just 11. Interesting.
Yeah, so we have to make sure that we're clear here. These ages often were estimates.
Yeah.
But again, you know, they were born free in Virginia. So his parents were born free, and of course they were born free. So that's always important to note. It's much easier to trace the genealogy of someone who wasn't born free because they kept meticulous property records. And so if you have a president who's born a slave, you can go and trace him back and, you know, find out if he was born into slavery, if he was purchased. Those records are there for Virginia, Maryland meticulously. But if someone's born free, there's a lot of room for speculation. So it's, you know, freeborn Africans don't have the same detailed, the same ways of they didn't keep records for freeborn Africans as well as they did for enslaved people, because they kept those records as property records. So you have bills of sale, you have emancipation papers and things like that, which you don't have for freeborn Africans. And one other thing, if you can go back, I wanted to point out that that they lived in Caldwell. I think that's important to know. So they settled in Caldwell, and Caldwell was a place where people had small farmsteads where they grew their own food, you know, took care of themselves. Sometimes they'd have an ox or two, but they tilled the land. So Gardiner and his family settled in Caldwell, and that's where they worked the land, and that's where he went to school and became literate, and later on went to law school and became the first attorney general. So I just wanted to point that out, and that their occupation, of course, was that of a farmer. I don't know if the print is big enough for you to see, but that was important.
Yeah, farmer.
Okay.
And we see that they were located in Caldwell.
Yes.
I wonder near Grady Allison house. Massacre in Virginia.
Yeah, so this is the Nat Turner Rebellion that occurred shortly after their arrival. This happened in August of the same year, 1831. I wanted to point that out because even where they started, the authorities started seeing, they saw this coming. They didn't know Nat Turner was going to have this kind of violent rebellion, but they saw the discomfort, and they thought that the free Africans were the ones who were inciting the enslaved people. You've got this large number of African people in the population who are free. When I say African people, I mean Black people in the population who are free. They're not in bondage. And this serves as hope for those who are in bondage. So this becomes a conflict. We talk about the mass, removal of people from Virginia and Maryland, but also Nat Turner, who was born into slavery, was a liberation theologist, a preacher, then feels that, hey, he's called by God to hold this rebellion. There was a solar eclipse. He saw that as a sign from God. And you can read about the Nat Turner rebellion. It's all over the place on the internet. Very interesting story. The reason I'm emphasizing it is I wanted to show the kind of people, the kind of community that the Gardiner family came from when they went to Liberia. These people were cut from the same cloth as Nat Turner. These people came from a culture of dignity in the middle of humiliation and subjugation. They had the dignity and the resilience of people who knew that they had a God-given right to be free. And so that also helps to guide Gardiner in his process and helps Gardiner, I would say, participate in the process of breaking away from the ACS colony and creating a republic. That's important. I mean, the spirit of Nat Turner has come to Liberia. The revolutionary Virginians have come to Liberia. And so that's why I'm tying this in.
Jabari, you were saying something?
No, I'm good right now. How you on?
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap up here and turn it over to.
The only thing I was going to say is the Nat Turner Revolt is what's going to encourage the Virginia House of Representatives and the Virginia Senate to attempt to pass legislation that says that all Black people who are free got to leave and go to Africa or some other state, preferably Africa, because they'll still be on the American continent. But yeah, they did attempt to pass legislation basically saying, yeah, y'all need to go. Yes.
Yeah. So our President Gardiner comes on the eve of all of this chaos, but the reason that they went is because they were at that, they were part of that vanguard. His family was part of that vanguard. So that spirit of liberty was in them before independence. And then I'm going to turn it over to you shortly. I'm just going to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to emphasize that Gardiner was not the first true Whig president. That distinction goes to Roy, and then the second is Smith. Gardiner's the third, but he's the first among the continuous presidents to Talbert. So he's the first in the uninterrupted line of true Whig rule up to Talbert. Many of our people think that Joseph Jenkins Roberts was a true Whig president. There's only been one political party in Liberia since its inception. I think your show, both of this platform and Jabari's platform, have debunked that thoroughly. Clearly, we had other political parties, but Gardiner, in the presidency anyway, there were other political parties during this period. So true Whig party, Liberia was not a one-party state. There were multiple political parties throughout our history, but Gardiner was the first in a long succession of true Whig presidents. Doesn't mean they didn't have opposition. Doesn't mean other people didn't run for president, and we will get to those as we get to the next presidents. They had opposition. They had other political parties that tried to unseat them, members of other branches of government from other political parties as well. So it was not a one-party state, as people would like us to believe. So I put this stamp here. This stamp was from 1979 when Talbert was president, and he honored himself and Gardiner in the True Whig Party by showing, and it's almost prophetic. I don't think Talbert knew in 1979 that he was the last True Whig president of Liberia, but he created this stamp in memorial to Gardiner, who was the first in unbroken succession. And he depicted Gardiner as the same complexion as himself. That's important to note. That in the stamp, Talbert, I keep saying Tubman, forgive me, Talbert and Gardiner are depicted of the same complexion. He's not depicted any differently from Talbert, who we all know was a Black man. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Jabari. to go into the details of the presidency.
Jabari, it's all yours.
Yes. So I got all of this on there. So yes. So he served from 1878 to 1883. Now, Anthony W. Gardiner had been in political office much more than just being a president or attorney general. He was Speaker of the House of Representatives. He served as vice president under Joseph Jenkins Roberts. So he has been in the political arena for quite a long time before he assumes the presidency. So during his time in the government, Gardiner has a situation that happens between Liberia and the Grebo Nation. And this was what was going to prevent him from becoming president in the earlier years because of this war. So it was the Grebo Maryland War. So this is the second Grebo Maryland War. There are two Grebo Maryland Wars that happened. So one happened in 1856 to 1857. The other one happens again in 1875. Eventually, there is an agreement that happens. And as this agreement is happening, that is what's going to leave a bitter taste in a lot of the Republican Party's mouth, because this is happening under Joseph Jenkins Roberts' presidency. And remember, Gardiner is serving in his administration and he's mishandling the situation. So he's eventually not going to be selected as the Republican Party. So this is the Republican Party. This shows that there was often, people going from different parties. It wasn't always fixed. And the Republican Party and the True Whig Party, briefly, it went back earlier in the 1840s. It was the pro-administration and the anti-administration party. That was the major differences between them. And you had other parties, smaller parties that would emerge. So recaptured Africans, those who were supposed to have been sold into slavery, but ships were seized, they ended up staying in Liberia. They would start aligning with the True Whig Party. And Anthony W. Gardiner is really what begins the era of the True Whigs. Of course, you're going to have other parties. The Republican Party is still there. And as a matter of fact, as we go into the later presidents, we have somebody who's infamous in Pan-Africanism. He's going to run as part of the Republican Party. But Anthony W. Gardiner really signals the True Whig Party's arrival. They are officially in power, and they're going to be a perennial force throughout the decades to come. So he joins the True Whig Party, and he is going to defeat James Briggs Payne. And when he becomes the president, he's the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence. So if we can go a little bit further, of course, you have the True Liberian, the True Whigs. So he's the last signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, Anthony W. Gardiner was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, along with Hillary Teague, Elijah Johnson, Amos Herring, John Jay, Jane Lewis, Ephraim Titler. He is the last surviving member of the Liberian Declaration of Independence, those who signed it on July 26th, that made it Africa's oldest republic. So before we get into full in depth surrounding his presidency, I would like to bring up situations that are happening sort of earlier, because some of this stuff happens before the presidency. So he takes office in 1878. In 1878, that's when, if you know about William Tolbert, the Liberian Exodus Association. So at the end of Reconstruction, there is mass racial violence that's happening. Troops are being withdrawn from the South. The Democratic Party has officially sort of seized power. It's referred to in American history as the redemption. It's when they have officially, these former Confederates who were barred from office, officially start to take power across the South. And as this is happening, hopes are being dashed. And so you have the Liberian Exodus Association that is happening. And their goal is to send at least up to 140,000, 160,000 African Americans over a period of 40 years. So they're going to leave from Charleston. They're going to be going to Liberia and coming back every month or 2 months or so. And so what happens is you have the Liberian Stock Exchange Company that is founded during this time when Gardiner takes office. This is also going to be the time in which Henry O. Flipper, the first Black man to graduate from West Point, has graduated. And it's during this time, along with the Liberian Exodus Association, that rumors flare that he's going to go serve in the Liberian Army. This is in the Colored Cadet.
So Jabari, 1 second. So we have the Liberian Exodus Society being formed here in the United States.
Yes.
And also the Liberia Stock Exchange. Talk a little bit about that stock exchange. What was it for? To raise money for Liberia? What was it?
Yes. So the stock exchange's purpose is to raise money so that African Americans can immigrate to Liberia. So people would buy stocks and it would become profitable, and you would have African Americans over the next 40 years being able to come in the thousands to Liberia. Unfortunately, again, this is happening during Reconstruction, and this is why a lot of Back to Africa movements fail. It's not that African Americans don't desire to go back, but remember, we got to get ships, and these ships cost money. And a lot of African Americans at this time don't have money because we were enslaved. We weren't able to accumulate wealth. A lot of us have gotten into land leasing or convict leasing, excuse me. You have the situation where sharecropping is arising. So these African Americans are not able to accumulate enough money for this stock exchange and this stock program to maintain itself. And so after that ship that would carry Tolbert from South Carolina, well, Tolbert's family from South Carolina to Liberia, that stock exchange program closes and it's shut down. So no more ships leave from Charleston or from the Liberian Exodus Association because of lack of funding. And that happens with Henry Adams in Louisiana during this time period as well. You have Benjamin Pap Singleton in the United Transatlantic Society. He's not able to accumulate enough money, and people are sending letters to Rutherford B. Hayes saying, hey, can the government assist us? We have over 98,000 African Americans who want to go. We have the American Colonization Society saying, we can't give you enough money. We have to be very selective of the people that we send over there. So these movements have failed as Anthony W. Gardiner is taking into power, or movements that are happening as he's taking into power. To get back to Henry O. Flipper, rumor that he's going to serve in the Liberian Army, he comes and basically says, I have nothing to do with this organization. I don't want to be a part of it. He says, I'm not trying to leave Rutherford B. Hayes to do this glory of ruling this great African army, because he was going to be commander-in-chief of the Liberian Army. He was going to be overseeing the Liberian Army had he be willing to go over with the Liberian Exodus Association and, Anthony W. Gardiner. They're reaching out to him. But he basically says, I have nothing to do with it. He's going to condemn it. And one of the things that you will notice about this is it's the respectability politics. It's the respectability politics. And he's going to be, instead of trying to build Liberia, he's going to be busy waging wars out in the plains, what we call the plain wars against Native Americans. That's what he's doing when he rejects or refuses to want to go to Liberia to serve as commander-in-chief. And he ends up getting stabbed in the back. He eventually gets criminal.
Can I come in for just a quick second? Sorry to interrupt you, Jabari. So that's a lot of information. I want to clarify two things. One, I think is important to point out is partly because they didn't have money, but also there was a deliberate movement to sabotage African American led movements to Africa. They did not want the population to have control over the process because it would then have removed the custodian or the stewardship of the white, elite who wanted to fund the process so they could control it. That's important. And the second thing is, talk a little bit, I'll just leave it to you to talk a little bit about this frontier war and the term Buffalo Soldiers and where that all comes from, so that people can make that connection as well.
People have this misconception that the Buffalo Soldiers means that, the Native Americans respected them and all of this, but Native Americans have come out constantly for decades and say, no, these African Americans who were part of the Plain Wars held many anti-Native viewpoints. We're referring to them as red savages. We're referring to them, calling them disparaging names. We're complicit in removing these Native Americans, such as the Lakotas and the Apaches and the Sioux, from their land for white settlers to come in. And as I stated earlier, Henry O'Flipper is going to participate in this, and then he's going to get stabbed in the back by the same U.S. Army that's going to criminally charge him and get him kicked out of the United States military. So this is, again, the racial respectability politics and the internalized, I want to be part of white society. Instead of being willing to go to Liberia, where he would have been a commander, he would have been the top general, he turns it down to try to prove himself in the U.S. Army, and that same U.S. Army criminally charges him, expels him from the Army. He doesn't get that criminal charge removed until a century later. So I wanted to give that context before we get into Anthony W. Gardiner's presidency, the background situation that's going on, because we're going to have to go even further of what's going to happen during his presidency in the context, because his presidency is when the scramble for Africa is going to start to go into full overdrive.
It's important to give that background because, and especially as it connects to that scramble for Africa. So, and that's why when I was reading about Gardiner, I would say for the first time, I mean, this is so amazing at the time that he came to power, all the things that were happening, and at the end, what he did. But let's go back to our series here.
Yes, so as president, he wanted more entries to increase trade. So background, or I think you guys may have covered it earlier. It was in 1864. There was a Port of Entry Act that basically said that there were certain ports that Liberians or foreign traders could enter. They could not. There was not a lot of port of entries that you could just do in Liberia. There were certain places that you could go, that port of entry. So he's going to do that. He's going to try to have more ports of entry to increase trade, because Liberia needs trading partners. I mean, it needs money and it needs to export material, so it needs trading partners. Laws that would encourage foreign capital for investment, including the native people in the nation's politics and promoting public education system. Now, this has been part of the true Whig Party tradition. So remember, E.J. Roy wants to do the same thing. He wants to invest in the public education, and he wants to get foreign investment to build a railroad to the interior that would have connected the coastal regions to the interior, make goods and transportation easier. Anthony W. Gardiner wants to do something similar. He wants to get the indigenous population into this. One of the myths that's constantly portrayed is that these African Americans completely disregarded the indigenous population. They wanted nothing to do with them. They make up this myth of the apartheid state that never happened, that never existed, when these African Americans made it their mission to go and connect with these indigenous groups in the interior. And remember, it's not easy. Remember, we don't have a locomotive. We have to walk by foot. Liberia doesn't have a lot of stagecoach or horses where we can just pick up and go into the interior. This stuff takes months, and this is evident by Benjamin J.K. Anderson. So Anthony W. Gardiner wants to include the indigenous population, and he wants to invest in the public education. And this goes into the founders valuing education. Continue.
Right. And if you can emphasize more on that, because it's the same time that Benjamin Jacob Anderson is exploring.
Yes. So this was around the same time. It was earlier. It was just a few years earlier when Benjamin J.K. Anderson went to the interior and he made these agreements. This is also the time where some of the inland areas are going to be incorporated into Liberia, because what we know today as Liberia is a fraction as big as what it was in the 1870s till the end of the scramble for Africa. So many of these ethnic groups and just ethnic groups are starting to come into the nation, such as Ibrahim Sisi. You have the situation that's happening with Benjamin J.K. Anderson. All of this is going on as the true Whigs and Anthony W. Gardiner want to advocate, for education and including them in, because they're coming into the country. They're becoming officially part of the nation.
Yeah.
So now the true Whigs established government positions. They established the interior in 1880 with Edward Wilmot Blyden serving as the first Secretary of the Interior. Now, later on, it's going to be talking about a later president, but Edward Wilmot Blyden will be an oppositional figure, but yet he's serving in the true Whig administration. He's going to be an oppositional figure in the upcoming years, but he's serving as the interior, the Secretary of the Interior for the Interior Department. That shows sort of the cross connecting, the willing to work together, not the political polarization that we see today, where if anybody's of the opposite party, they're just completely polar opposite and they ain't no compromise. There's a lot of cross compromising and a lot of crossing that's happening between the true Whigs and what's left of the Republican Party. And he also is going to join the Universal Postal Union.
And Jabari, the Secretary of the Interior is what we have today as Minister of Internal Affairs. Just for people watching, if you don't know that. Cool. So
this is where all of the scramble for Africa is going to come into place. And for folks who do not know, the scramble for Africa started decades ago. People think like it's 1884. Nah, it was happening way earlier. In West Africa, Britain takes the Cape Coast, or not Cape Coast, or takes the Gold Coast. Now, for those who do not know, Britain was not the first one to take the Gold Coast. People have this thing that it was Britain. It was actually Denmark, and then it was Sweden. Sweden and Denmark had fought over that part of the Gold Coast, and Denmark had it until the 1850s, and then it was transferred to England, and England now has it. So that has been happening. Sierra Leone is now a full-fledged colony. It started out as a committee for the relief of the Black poor. We have Freetown. Some of the free Blacks want to become an independent nation, but they end up getting expelled. Harry Washington and so Sierra Leone is now a full-fledged colony. Now you having places in the interior start to become European influence, and this is because modern medicine. So prior to modern medicine, Europeans were not able to get that far into the interior. They really were not able to. They were only able to take parts of the coast. That's why a lot of the slave ports, a lot of stuff that's happening when it refers to the colonization of Africa is happening on the coastline. With the invention of modern medicine, now they're going further into the interior. So now we're having wars happening with interior nations. This is happening in West Africa. This is happening with the Dahomean people. You're having the Franco-Dahomean wars that are breaking out. You have it in the Southern Africa with the Anglo-Bapedi, the Anglo-Basutu, the Anglo-Zulu wars. So Liberia is fortunate to still remain standing because a lot of these African kingdoms are going to be falling like dominoes. First is going to be Dahomeans. Then you have the Zulus that have already fought, because at this moment, the Zulus have been defeated. When Anthony W. Gardiner is in power, the Zulus have officially been defeated and have been incorporated into the British Empire. You have a situation. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. So one of the things I wanted to point out, and you're putting out a lot of information, so I'm just coming in to kind of make sure that our audience is really getting the meat of what you're saying. Yes, modern medicine. One of the things that the British were masters at is spying. Their spy game was correct, meaning that they knew how to get enough information about divisions among people to be able to use them against each other. So it was not only modern medicine, but it was this infiltration and the studying of the culture and the divisions, the conflicts. You have to remember that these empires were already in perpetual conflict with one another. So the French and the British intelligence were able to infiltrate and also use these conflicts to their advantage by siding with one against another. So this is not just sheer military might, but it was really about strategic war planning, where, okay, I find out that the Fulani in Futajalan have an issue with the Malinka. So I am going to use the Fulani against the Malinka. And this is also a period. We're going as far as the Zulu, but you're also talking about Samori Touré's Wosulu Empire. This is the period of that rising up against the French. And the French are using other Africans to fight Samori Touré. So most of the opposition to Samori Touré are African opponents to him that have been militarized and empowered and backed by French infrastructure and infantry, war machines, weapons, and other resources so they can fight Samori. I just wanted to point that out. But great job, Jabari. I'll get out.
Good points. No, good point, because that's true. We're going to see that with the Sokoto Caliphate. We're going to see that with the Aro Confederacy. We're going to see these divisions come to a hold, and that's going to happen to Liberia in later presidencies. Not now, but in later presidency series. Them using the indigenous ethnic groups of Liberia against the current government. So you have the territorial dispute between the British government and Liberia over the Galinas territory. Now remember, before Liberia used to encompass the Galinas territory. In 1882, British authorities, again, they now have full control. Sierra Leone is a colony. They want that Galinas territory. So what do? They send gunboats to Monrovia, basically saying you can either give up this territory or you can get this bombing. So what is he got to do? You don't have the military might like that. I mean, you're going to have to sign this accord. So he's going to sign the Sir Havelock Accord with Sir Havelock, who's the current governor, who's currently ruling Sierra Leone, and Edward Blyden. And they criticize Gardiner's actions, and his own vice president is going to lead the opposition against his decision. And his vice president is Alfred Russell. So the treaty was rejected by the Liberian Senate, rejects it, saying we're going to lose territory. Havelock returns to Liberia in September and says, we want to ratify this treaty.
And Jabari, before you continue, it's important that we stress this, because when you look at what we have today, here is a situation, this military general coming from the Sierra Leone territory or the colony and come with a gunboat and say, hey, give us this land, else we bomb you. And after President Gardiner, through his secretary, Edward Blyden, say, okay, what can we do? Sign this, right? But then people said, no, you are giving up our land. In fact, looking at Blyden, that, traitor, you selling this to, and your own vice president, something that is unheard of, in recent years, that your own vice president will come up openly to oppose you. And that's what Alfred F. Russell did. So I'm looking back and comparing it to what we have, in recent years. And I mean, tremendous courage. People could actually disagree. I don't want to be political, but I would say, nobody was packed.
Yeah, so but it shows that they really cared about their territory. They cared about defending it. They cared. There was a sense of pride and understanding that you don't go down without a fight.
Right.
That if we're gonna fight for every square inches, we're gonna do what's in the best of the republic. So Gardner
these were
and
philosophical
Havelock are
differences.
not going to go ahead.
No, I said these were kind of differences based on what they believe, and not simply other trivial things. Well, we are in the same party, so let's just roll together or stuff like that.
Yeah, I also want to point something out about this fight for the territory. So people think the fight for the territory was really just about resources. A lot of this was not only about land resources. It was about making sure that African people weren't subjugated. The original purpose of Liberia being created as a republic in 1847 was to be a beacon of hope that African people would continue to govern themselves. And so the attack, the affront against the African continent, especially against the established Liberian territory, was an affront to African people. So they were defending, alongside the indigenous territory that was sovereign. They wanted it to remain sovereign in the sovereign control of the people who were there. And a lot of the indigenous people who were used against the republic had the misunderstanding, which was deliberately done by the British and the French, to believe that if they fought the Liberian government, they would remain sovereign, when in fact they were fighting against their sovereignty. Sovereignty was not really even an option anymore. And so the British and French were able to masterfully convince some indigenous people, if you fight for us against the Liberians, you will remain sovereign. And it was the opposite was true. So much of it was self-sabotage induced by a disinformation campaign. The reality is, what Liberia was trying to do was keep Africa African in so many ways. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
They're going to keep doing that for decades to come. They almost came close to actually doing it a few decades later, but that sabotage has been going on for decades. And so Gardiner and Havelock are not going to reach an agreement when Gardiner's in office. So he's not going to come to an agreement when he resigns in 1883. That's going to be for his successor to deal with.
Right. So Gardner resignation was not solely about being sick. The pressure from Liberians, people in the Senate, also forced him because of this land issue. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was a serious issue because this is not just Britain. You have France, and if we go to the next slide, I think it's the next slide. Yeah, in the next slide, you even have Germany that's going to start to come into play. But this is what's going on. You have the scramble for Africa that's happening. You have the Gardiner territory and the San Pedro River that's being taken from Liberia. That part, the San Pedro's, where the Kabbalah River is, that is going to the French. Okay? And remember, Benjamin J.K. Anderson had laid these territorial claims with treaties from local kingdoms. These were not, Liberia's territory was not forced, as people like to say, because one thing that people love to say is Liberia came through displacement of indigenous people and all of this, and through military might. And I'm like, the African Americans did not have the might to displace these people and get these current borders. These borders came as a result of treaties by local kingdoms, okay? And they were set in stone. This is what was happening from Boparu in Guinea. So I want you to understand just how wide Liberia was. We're talking about from the Galinas territory in Sierra Leone, the San Pedro River in Ivory Coast, all the way to Bopuru in modern-day Guinea. That's how big of Liberia we are talking about. Liberia is only about 85 to 80% of what it used to be when it was in the 1880s or 1890s. That's how big we're talking about and how much territory Liberia lost during the scramble for Africa. So again, European powers, Great Britain, France, Germany, but I want to end the point. That's what Cal brought up earlier. Native people are going to contest Liberia's sovereignty. They're going to be in indigenous nations that don't want the Liberian government to exist because that's going to be a threat to their power. Okay? If I got to adhere to this Liberian government, that means I got to be willing to sacrifice power. Well, if I want power, I'm not going to want this Liberian authority. I want this power for me and myself and my nation. So what do? I need to deal with this Liberian government in Monrovia. And that's where you're going to see, again, the Grebel uprising that happens in Maryland County is an example of that. Next slide.
I'm going to come in really quickly. So the Grable Uprising was a continuous process. It's what even made Maryland become part of Liberia in the first place in the 1850s. So this is not something new under Gardiner. It is a continuous process. And if you look at French naval and military records, it was instigated by the French. They wanted to use, as the British did, as other Europeans did, they wanted to use the indigenous rifts to, almost have a proxy war that would work out in their favor. It was a tried and proven method of destabilizing Africa for them to be able to infiltrate. They have done it for a very long time, and it continues to this day, using divisions within a population, exacerbating them, siding with one side, antagonizing the other, and empowering one group against the group that they want to conquer. The sad and tragic truth is sovereignty was not an option. And I don't like to use the word Grable nation. These were Grable clans. The Grable people, the Cloud-speaking and Cloud-related ethnic groups didn't really have a nation as the people in the north and central regions did. They had clan-based societies. So these Grable clans, these Cloud-speaking and ethnically related clans were being told that if you fight these people, you will be able to continue your way of life. Unfortunately, that was really not a possibility. That really was not an option. They were really just helping another group of conquerors who were going to be more brutal conquerors and actually take their land. As you can see with those who are now part of Ivory Coast, they're landless. And those who remained in Liberia still have claim to their land. And it's a tragedy that the government of Liberia was not able to properly articulate to those leaders who their true enemy was.
Right. And because the concept of a nation did not exist like in the Southeast, as you said, these were clans. So your little group is a group by itself. So if a power in Monrovia is coming to take over, and that's what I believe that was easy to do, because you say resist them, you are your own people, right? Not knowing that if you resist people from Monrovia, what's end up going to be happening is you're going to be part of the French. But they were made to know that hey, you're going to be on your own, right?
And not even part of the French. You're going to be conquered and subjugated, literally enslaved by the French, and your land rights are going to be taken away, which is exactly what happened. And you're going to be put into forced labor camps. You're going to be forced to build infrastructure for French extraction. Abidjan, all of these places were built with forced labor. And people died. And right now to this day, the remnants of that, you have people coming into Liberian territory today in 2022 to hunt, to farm, to do things that their ancestors and their cousins in Liberia do freely. They're not able to do freely in Ivory Coast. And that is the legacy of French imperialism that does not exist in Liberia.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to answer that question a quick yes. There have been times where the native population almost overthrew the government. And like I said, again, it happens in later decades, but they were waving the British flag as they were literally close to overthrowing the government. So it has happened. So this is not, oh, we're just throwing, like, no, this actually happened where they nearly overthrew the Liberian government and were waving the British flag while they were doing it. I just want to bring that up. Yeah. So again, another example, the crew in the eastern part of the country was not under control. Again, that's been going on. This has been mounting up for decades. It's not just spontaneous. But the most pressing problem was in the extreme western part of the country. Now, for those who are not aware, in the 1880s, you have the Gola-Mandingo War that is happening there as well. So we have that war that's happening, and that's control over that territory, over resources. That war is going on in Liberia between two ethnic groups. You have the situation that is happening with Germany with the scramble for Africa. So in the late 1870s and early 1880s, with growing European imperialism, you have the Berlin Conference that happens a year afterwards. And again, in 1883, on the eve of the international conference, you have a situation where right here, yes. That's where it was. On the eve, President Anthony W. Gardiner became the victim of the scramble for Africa as the carving up of the continent by 5 European powers is commonly known, that only left Liberia unconquered, though not affected. Okay, so he's gonna be the first witness to it. He's really gonna see it. So it's gonna be a perilous 30 years afterwards. Gonna be a long 30 years. So let's go to Germany. Again, Germany is going to be significant throughout Liberian history, especially from here to World War I to World War II. But here, again, Germany has its own scramble for Africa that it has. Now, brief background on Germany, because I know a lot about German history. In 1871, you have what's called the Franco-Prussian War. That war is going to result in the reunification of Germany. So prior to that, Germany was really just a bunch of city-states. It wasn't a unified nation state. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Franco-Prussian War is what's going to solidify Germany into becoming a sovereign nation. It's the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck. So now Germany, after becoming a unified nation, is the largest, it's the most populous nation in Europe. It is on the cusp of wanting to become an empire. So you have a situation where what happens in Liberia is you have a German vessel that's going to get looted by the natives. It is on the Crew coast. So a German vessel is going to be looted along the Crew coast by the natives. The next slide should show it. The next slide should show about the German vessel. So the Germans are then going to lead a bombardment. And the Germans are going to show up to Monrovia and ask for damages, payment, with the threat of bombardment of the capital. Similar to what Great Britain says. If you don't give us this land, we're gonna bomb you. Same thing with this German vessel. You don't pay for the damages of this German vessel, we are going to bomb you. Now, of course, later on in years, Germany actually does do it. But in this instance, they are going to threaten to bomb the capital if you do not pay for it. So Liberia has to pay for these damages.
Right. And what was the evidence that the looting was done by the natives, or was it like on a company ship?
Yeah, it was on
Nobody
it
in
was
it?
on a company it was on a company ship, and they found out because this is by the crew codes, and as usual, not a lot of African Americans were on the crew codes at that time. So when it happened, it was speculated that okay, it was done by the natives, and as a
Well,
result, go ahead.
well, let me just come in. So what happened? The context is there was anytime a vessel would wash up within the territory or the vicinity of any group of indigenous West Africans, it was a practice that they would then claim the property on the distressed vessel. It was a long-standing practice that went back long before the republic was established. And so among indigenous people, especially the coastal people, this was not an unusual practice. If your vessel washed up on their coast, it belonged to the people that were on the coast,
Washed up
whatever
means
was on the ship.
there is a wreckage.
Wreckage, anything like that. If your boat, that's just what it was. So the concept of it being a looting process is a very Western concept, right? So the concept of the indigenous people, hey, the thing washed up here is for us. We get to divide the bounty.
Right.
That had
That's
been
like
going on for a couple of centuries, so it wasn't new. I mean, you see many examples of that happening with different vessels from different European states where they would wash up and they would claim the bounty. So this particular incident, it wasn't a mystery, it wasn't a guess, it was a fact that it was these people, the indigenous people on the crew coast, that had, basically looted the vessel.
right.
Um,
So it's like finding a dead animal, right? So if there's a shipwreck and it's washed up on your coast, normally maybe the people are all dead, right? So you go in and take whatever.
even if they're
you want.
not, right? Even if they're not,
Okay.
what are they going to do? You've got we have to remember a lot of our people were armed. So you come in, hey, this is ours, get up, okay, whatever, what's on here? And slave ships washed up on our coast with human beings and they were released. So all kinds of things have happened on the coastal plain of Liberia. We are at the windward coast. I mean, there was a lot of traffic, not only in goods, but also in human beings. So this was something that happened more often than people might know. So this wasn't the first incident of a shipwreck and the goods being, taken or claimed, is probably a better word. And in a European concept, this is looting. And now, because it is Liberian territory, the government of Liberia is now responsible to repay instead of it being the people who looted. So that's the concept. And this was ongoing. This is not one or two times and where they pressured the Liberian government to intervene in any indigenous issues. We'll talk about that in other episodes. The other thing I want to also point out is that the laws and the traditions of indigenous people are not always in sync with the Western laws and traditions and their understanding of correctness. So there is that conflict as well in the perception of what is correct and what is not correct behavior, if that makes sense. So I'll turn it back over to Jabari.
No, that was important information. Thank you for chiming in. That was really important context. I didn't even know that myself, so I really appreciate you chiming in on that. So, of course, you have rivalries between European countries and the interests of the United States helped preserve Liberian independence. Now, the U.S. only is a minor help. Now, that's the important thing. People will say that America is like essentially what kept Liberia to become a part of France or Great Britain. It was basically like a vassal state. No, the United States played a minor role. And that was only when it was like, this is about to just absolutely like collapse. But otherwise, the U.S. was not really there to be found. I mean, it just wasn't like that. And there was also Black leaders here in America later on that would play a role in preserving Liberian sovereignty. So
You say United States did not really help.
no, the United States really never really cared about Liberia. It wasn't even the first country to recognize its independence until 1862 when it recognized Haiti. The United States only saw Liberia as just, okay, well, we have some connection with you, but we really don't want to have anything to do with you unless we can exploit you. That's when it's valuable. But
Yeah,
until
it
then, the
was a
United
source
States.
of cheap resources too, right? So there were ACS was also an economic venture in Liberia. They used to have these investors in the States. A lot of them were investing in Liberia because they were receiving goods. There was trade going on, and ACS was facilitating that. So there was a lot of economic activity around Liberia that benefited private citizens in the United States, private white citizens. So beyond that, there was not, beyond protecting that economic interest, there was not much else.
Yeah. So as I was talking about with Henry O. Flipper, it was the Colored Cadet, the Army, Navy, Air Force Journal and Register volume. That was 1878. The United States Army and Navy Journal and Gazette of the Regular Volunteer Force, 1877. These are some of the brief sources that you can read talking about his positions on Liberia, why he rejected it, the responses, the replies. So those are just 3 sources that you could use. All right.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining us, this is the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. Our guest presenter is Jabari Lamb, along with Carl. I'm not going to call that again. Pamela.
Yeah. Excellent.
And at
Thank
this
you,
time,
Jabari.
we're going to read comments, and if you want to be part of the conversation, the number is on the screen: 605-313-6004. The code is 791-403 £. Carl, when I was reading about ceding this land to the Sierra Leonean colony, to this big general, he says maybe what Blyden factored in when he was signing this, well, these are artificial border, because his idea of Pan-Africanism was we're going to be one anyway. So if these guys want to kill us for this boundary, I mean, they can have it. To us, we're going to have this one Pan-Africanist nation. So it really doesn't matter. We shouldn't die for this.
I mean, that's a way to look at it. I mean, you always have to balance existence, with annihilation. And Liberia's story is that in a nutshell, balancing existence with annihilation. And at some points in time, we've had leaders that have said freedom or death. And at other periods in time, we've had leaders that have said freedom deferred. Not, that we're not willing to die. It's more important that our children live and pick up the torch tomorrow and carry the freedom struggle forward. That has been the story of Liberia. Mm-hmm. It's basically been a story of struggling for freedom against tremendous, insurmountable odds. And the existence of Liberia today is a miracle. It's a historical miracle. I cannot think of any other country that exists today that has been through the adversity and the coordinated sabotage and war effort against its existence as Liberia, except maybe Haiti, that still exists today. And so we have to understand that Liberia has not had an opportunity to manifest its destiny, to become what it was intended to be, without the economic embargo, without the political sabotage, without the military sabotage, without the intentional disinformation campaigns. I mean, I can go on and on with the obstacles upon obstacles that have been thrown, the bombs upon bombs, the proverbial bombs that have been thrown at this little country, that up out of the ashes like a phoenix, it still rises. It's a miracle. It's shocking when you read the efforts that went into sabotaging the state, You know, we like to mock, you know, our president today and say, oh, you know, look at Liberia, it's a mess. It is a miracle that we still wave the flag. In the great scheme of things, and in the context of how we still exist with everything that's been thrown at us, it is perfectly understandable that things are as backward as they are. And once we understand that, we know where to pick up from. But we have to first know how we got here. And we have to understand that it is not necessarily our fault. And that the only responsibility that we have is to, in spite of all that's happened, continue this pressing desire that we're all born with to manifest our destiny, to create an environment where we can live and thrive and become what we were intended to be. Liberia is still a work in progress. It has not been attained yet, but we still have the roadmap to get there. And we need to understand, you know, where we are in this process. I think that a lot of these stories have been buried intentionally to confuse us. It's like the same thing, you know, you go to this other Grebo chief, or you go to this other Bandi chief, and you tell him, say, oh, Mr. Chief, these people here, these what did they used to call them, tabados or something, whatever they used to call African Americans. They had this name for them. The Mandingos had a name for them. These people that came, these funny dressing Africans that are dressed like Europeans, they are the problem. Help us get rid of them, and we can use business as usual. Meanwhile, they were planning to overthrow them. There were some people who were smart and wise to this, Samori Toure being one of them. Samori Toure was like, man, we're not falling for that okie doke. These Liberians are our brothers, you know, and Samori Toure reached out to the Liberian government, was like, hey, help us to fight these Europeans. So not all the native populations were fooled. Samori Toure told them, basically, you know, nobody's stupid here. You know, we're going to stand up to you. We're going to fight you too. And as a process, Liberia and Wosulu Empire held each other up for a period of time. Samori Toure sought refuge in Liberian territory. He was captured in Liberian territory, but he knew that Liberia was the only place he would be safe, because all the surrounding areas have been manipulated by the Europeans against him. So he went home to Liberia, you know, to seek refuge, and unfortunately was captured on Liberian soil. So not everybody was fooled by this okie doke, this game of divide and conquer. And so today, when I hear people thinking that, oh, there's this Muslim Christian divide in Liberia, I'm like, this is crazy. One of the greatest stories of unity, smuggling weapons to Samori Toure, were Christian Liberians smuggling weapons to this Islamic empire that was forming in the north. Because beyond their religion, they saw the kindred spirit, the need to survive the conquest of the West, of the imperialist conquest of Europe. And so they, for that moment in time, thanks to people like Blyden, for that moment in time, there was a unified spirit. That story needs to be told more.
Thank you. Let's go back to some things I just want us to clarify. So Gardiner served as vice president to Roberts, and he served his first term, second term, and he resigned his third term. He also was the acting president when they were doing that thing with Roy, right? So, I mean, how did that happen that he kind of broke, I would say that way, broke with Roberts to be on the Trowick side? I mean, what was it? What was it like? Did they have any major differences? Because it looked like he was Robert's preferred guy. So what happened in between there?
Remember, Gardiner doesn't get the nomination for the Republican Party. That goes to James Briggs Payne. So James Briggs Payne is now the leader of the Republican Party. So if you're Anthony W. Gardiner, the only opportunity you're going to get into power is through the true Whigs, because James Briggs Payne, he's already served as president, so he already has sort of the credentials in the Republican Party. And so the best option would be politically to do the true Whigs.
Yeah.
We talked about this last time, and it's important to remember Roberts is dead. Roberts is dead. James Briggs Payne becomes president because Roberts is dead.
Yeah.
And when Roberts died, so did the Republican Party, essentially. That's when it was really broken.
A couple months after.
Right, a couple months after, but when Payne was president the entire time, Roberts is dead.
Yeah.
So the conflict now people start to galvanize around something else, because Roberts was that charismatic father of the country. Nobody really wanted to go against him. We talked about his persona and his influence. He was feared. He was the Don Dada of Liberia. When he dies, his minions scatter. So even though everyone was kind of like, James Briggs Payne, we might, rally around him, at some point when he dies, it's like, you know what? We don't have to have this loyalty to Payne or anyone else. Roberts is gone. So now people are able to stand on their own and they're not following a person anymore. So there's a lot around that. But when Joseph Jenkins Roberts died, even James Briggs Payne starts to lose it. He starts to not have the kind of Roberts was what people pretend Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is. He was the guy who was making things happen. He was the guru of the society for the most part.
If we were to use a similar analogy, Joseph Jenkins Roberts is what we would say like the George Washington figure is. If you were to look at American politics, George Washington gets the presidency unanimously without any opposition. Then when John Adams comes into office, he's not as popular as George Washington. He only serves one term, and then the Democratic Republicans take over. The Federalists dissolve. You can look at the Republican Party and the Federalist Party of the United States and see a similar fate. George Washington is the face of the Federalists. John Adams is the last Federalist to serve. The Federalists lose after the Democratic Republic to the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, and the Democratic Republicans rule for decades to come until Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
We have a question here, a very long one from Dr. George Gompu. Why are your guests painting a rosy picture of Liberian history? The notion that Liberians are more dignified than Ivorians sounds highly misleading. Why did native Liberians wave the British flag? The evidence instead is that the natives had to choose between colonial powers, either the colonization of the Liberian government or the colonization by European powers. So, in essence, the native behavior were rational and not due to naivete, due to the assumed promise of native sovereignty. Dr. George Gompu.
So I will go first on this. So to say that it was between colonization is factually not true. There was a situation that happens during the scramble for Africa when French officials would ask these indigenous groups, which part of the country did they want to be a part of? They could either be part of France or they could be part of Liberia. And the indigenous group specifically said that they wanted to be part of Liberia. Secondly, to say it was between two colonial powers completely mitigates the power that native populations had. And this is one of the certain problems when we talk about African history, is we portray our people as if they were primitive, as if they did not have military capabilities, as if at any given point they could not take the Liberian government down. These native populations had arms. They had muskets. They had guns. These were not docile native people that just got steamrolled and stomped. A prime example would be, look at even in the case of South Africa, since people love bringing up South Africa. Lesotho is its own country. Why is Lesotho its own country? The British were constantly having to fight the Basotho people, even the Zulus, even the Xhosa. This idea that somehow the native population just got steamrolled and had no choice is completely ahistorical. It completely diminishes their influence, and it portrays them as people who don't have any power, that didn't have guns, muskets, their own fully formed government and interest in power. So that would be my response. Why would they wave the Union Black flag? There were Black people during the American Revolution that were fighting for the Loyalists. There were Black people during the Second Italian-Ethiopian War when Ethiopia was invaded by Italy, who were fighting for the Italians. There have been plenty of examples of people fighting for opposing sides, but they're doing it why? For their interest. This is not one of the things we got to stop looking at history is this morality. This was not morality. This was a decision that they chose to do. This was not because they felt good or they did it because it matched their interest, period. They waved the Union flag because they were going to get what they thought, what they wanted to suit their power and interest. Not this is going to make them feel good. Because we can talk about, again, the Gola Mandinka War that's breaking out in the upper part of the country. You have other crew wars that are happening amongst each other. That's happening during this time period. So that would be my whole point in addressing, it's between two colonial powers, which, by the way, colonialism means to be backed by state power in a mother country. So even the term colonialism is inadequate in and of itself.
Exactly.
Let
And Dr. Gumbo, let me respond to that as well, Dennis. I need to say something.
I want to add another leg to it because it's adding to it. That's why I want to read before you come in.
Okay.
Is that the existence of Liberia is a miracle? How? What do you mean Liberia was not given an opportunity to succeed? Which other nation in Africa were provided an opportunity? A sovereign nation should design its own policy and path to progress.
So again, hold on, Jabari. Let me respond to. I don't know why Dennis didn't wait to ask that because it's not related to the first part. The first part of this that I need to address is that besides colonialism being backed by a foreign state power, it also has to do with the eradication of land rights for indigenous people. That never happened in Liberia. Liberians, I challenge anyone to show me where the indigenous land rights of Liberian people have ever been removed. Liberians, majority of the land, when I worked for the Land Authority, it was about 86% of the land in the Liberian territory was in the control of indigenous people. Dr. Gumpu is from Nimba. I want you to tell me what part of Nimba County is owned by the descendants of American Liberians. This is an absurdity that we believe these things without evidence just because it's in our minds. This is like a part of this whole disinformation campaign. We who come from Nimba, we who come from places that we have complete control and access to our land, still say things like we've been colonized. It's absurd. In Ivory Coast, that is not the case. So when I talked about them being fooled or tricked or bamboozled into thinking that if they sided with the French, they would continue the lives that they are. The Grebo people in Ivory Coast, with the part of Ivory Coast up to the San Pedro River, do not own their land. Those properties there are owned by French farmers, massive French farmers. The managers of those farms are mostly people from other French territories like Burkina Faso. And most of those people today in 2022, when they need to hunt or farm or do anything, they encroach on Liberian territory because their ancestors made the wrong decision. We are poor landowners because we were never colonized. We are poor landowners because no one took our land rights away. To this day, if you want to do anything in Liberia, it requires a tribal certificate. Some indigenous chief somewhere, whether educated or not, has the authority to decide whether or not the government proceed with development. They must be at the table. That doesn't happen in Ivory Coast. That doesn't happen. Before independence now. That didn't happen anywhere. And to this very day in Liberia, people argue that the hindrance to our development is the fact that we have land sovereignty for indigenous people. I've heard Europeans, I've heard World Bank people, and people from the IMF argue that that is our problem. Is that, you've got all this land in the control of these native people. This is the same argument that the British were making in the 19th century. And for very, very educated Liberians, who I respect when it comes to the understanding of economics, they know very little about Liberian history and how it differs from other countries. They know very little about how other countries were developed and why Liberia isn't. And so when you talk about Liberia's existence as a miracle, sir, with all due respect, the economic sabotage, the trade embargoes that were set against Liberia. Go back and watch the previous episodes of the Liberian History Channel. We break down the systematic and coordinated effort to block Liberia's progress every single step of the way, from the very beginning that we declared our independence.
Thank you. This one
to add to the point,
we can move on to the next comment.
yeah.
He said, I didn't know that Liberia had multi-party democracy prior to 1980 coup, because we were taught it was only one-party system since 1847. Thanks for the excellent clarification. Agnes Young, thanks for the information. Unfortunately, the young people that need this education are not getting it. And we all need it. Let me read this last comment and then you can come in. Oh, okay, that was it. Yeah, this one. It's a great Liberian history unknown to many, especially with the poor education system and human displacement caused by wars. Educational revolution is needed. And you can get it right here on Focus on Liberia. Go ahead, Jabari.
Yes. And I want to go to the point of first the quick colonization, and we're going to get to the sabotage. If people consider Liberian colonization, what do y'all consider Dahomey, the Zulu Empire, the Mali Empire, the Congo Empire, all these ancient African empires that we glorified? So Liberia is colonial, but all these other empires ain't imperialist and ain't colonial. That's one point. So if y'all go, I said this on Twitter before, if y'all gonna say Liberia is colonial, then y'all better say the Zulus were colonial, you better say the Xhosas were colonial, you better say the Congo people were colonial, you better say Dahomey was colonial, Ashanti, you better say all these African empires were colonial, because they literally built their empires off of war. So, but we don't want to have that conversation. It's only when it's Liberia that everybody wants to throw that colonialism card out there. Secondly, saying that Liberia was not sabotaged is a vast understatement. I mean, Marcus Garvey was planning to set up his whole UNIA in Liberia. And when word got out that that's what he was planning to use Liberia as his place to do his radical anti-colonial decolonization of Africa, the British and the French threatened Liberia with invasion. They constantly bribed the Liberian government to not allow him to set foot on Liberian soil. And the UNIA had land in Liberia. That same land in Liberia was given to Firestone. The current Firestone land that we know today was supposed to have been given to Garvey to set up his stuff for the UNIA, and it was given to Firestone.
Thank you. This one from Coach King said, greetings, especially to Miss Carl family. I mean, Coach King would just come and rub it in. Can't even tell me hello, only call. Coach King, that is. All right. Time is fast spent. We still got few comments here, so we can wrap up. I'm going to say thanks so much. Great show. There was another one that I wanted to read. I can't find it now. So many comments, but Spencer believe Liberia is a powerful country. Spencer continue. Carl and Jabari, my respect for both of you. Thanks for the eye-opening revelation. Let's wrap up on Gardiner and set the stage of where we go next. Jabari, let me start with you. What's your, and one thing I was also thinking about is because the way we have studied this president or we heard about them, it's like we I mean, not the recent one, but way like Gardiner. I mean, I still hear the name Gardiner in Liberia, but who are his family members? Who are some of the descendants that we can find today? So if you are watching the show and you have any connection with President Anthony William Gardiner, please put your comment, leave a comment, and let's know. Let's be able to trace these people. He was representing Grand Bassa County. He came from there to sign the Declaration of Independence. So there's a little more, and we want to find more. If you are related to Anthony Gardiner, please let us know. we want more. We want more. We want to be able to maybe see some of his relatives, his land. Where did he live? You know, I want to go to that place. I want to see some of his backyard. I mean, this thing should be there, right? So modern day, what? Uh, okay. Coach King, Thurman Gardiner, the former police director, that's the relative, and also T Mobile. So every time we discuss these presidents, we want to make that connection. Jabari, let's conclude.
I'm going to say that we have to take pride in our history and stop allowing these negative images of our history to be the dominant narrative. Again, no other groups, no other nations base their history off of negative historical events. I don't care if it's China, Russia, Japan, Korea, United States. Everybody bases their history off of positive energy and the accomplishments that their people do. Only in Liberian history, and the way Liberian history is told, do we strictly focus on the negatives, and especially focus on one narrative that really has no historical backing and doesn't use historical archives. We are the only group of people that will bash our country to no end and will say it is the equivalent of what white people did, equivalent to what apartheid South Africa did, when the same country opposed apartheid South Africa, had the very same Black South Africans in their country educating them, such as Nelson Mandela, who stayed in Liberia, Miriam Makeba, and other anti-apartheid activists. But we are the ones who say our government was like an apartheid state. We are the only group of people who will say that this group of people acted like white people, when literally the behavior that they were doing was no different than the same African nations were acting. But again, we like to blame ourselves. I defend Liberia hardcore because I'm not going to let somebody bash Liberia, but you would feel perfectly uncomfortable if I bash your country, whether it be Rwanda, Nigeria, or Angola. Have some pride. As an African American, I have pride in Liberia. There's a reason why Liberia was there. There's a reason why many African American activists look to Liberia as liberation, whether or not it was Henry McNeil Turner, Paul Cuffey, Absalom John, James Fortin, Henry Adams. You had Amy Ashwood Garvey, Nina Simone, Maya Angelou, Bill Russell. You had all of these different Black activists look to Liberia for inspiration and actually stayed there. It's time that we took pride in our founders, our history. Nothing is perfect, nothing is rosy. But my goodness, have some dignity, some respect that these founders had, because if it wasn't for these founders, you wouldn't be here and the country wouldn't exist.
Thank you. That's Darius Jabari Lamb putting in that the 3-point shot or a slam dunk on the show. Carl?
Yeah, so Jabari, I love your passion. You're absolutely correct. I think one of the things that I have noticed, and I'm grateful that I wasn't miseducated in Liberia, is that there was a deliberate disinformation campaign built into the curriculum and to basically, I call it the buck breaking of Liberia, to bury the truth about Liberian history and to create this divisive narrative so that the country could implode. It was intentional. It's not accidental. Most of our curriculum, our social studies programs, were created by missionaries from the Confederate South shortly after the Civil War. Most of our educators and the people who shaped our minds were people from the Jim Crow South during the antebellum period, right? Many of the people who created our schools and taught in our schools were Peace Corps people, again, from the segregated South, most of them. These people don't like you. They didn't like me. They don't like us. They intentionally went to Liberia to create these people who would be self-loathing people. I've not seen any group of Africans hate themselves the way Liberians do. The people in Ivory Coast have more reverence for white Frenchmen who enslaved them, spit upon them, made them build Abidjan, San Pedro with forced labor in chains. They have more reverence for the French than Liberians have for people who intermarried with them. It is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And what disappoints me is people who are educated, extremely well educated, have never taken the time to really study their own history for themselves, but rather regurgitate the narrative that was created by the enemies of our people to cause us to implode upon ourselves. You go to Ghana, there is no more disgrace and degradation than what happened to the people on the Gold Coast. We have not endured that as indigenous Liberian people. But yet the people on the Gold Coast adopted a name that was from far away from their land. They call themselves Ghanaians. They created a sense of nationalism and national identity that's really, a lot of it's based on our own history of Liberian history, right? You've got other countries taking our history and imposing it upon themselves to create pride among their citizens. This is our history. We don't even have pride in it. We were talking about, the indigenous people, Wasulu Empire. If you really want to understand what the brilliant minds of our past were, look at what Samori Toure and that connection to Liberia and how that man fought not only for himself but for Liberia. People don't talk about that. We don't talk about the indigenous people who put down the Liberian flag at the St. John River and told the French, you shall not cross. Nobody talks about why Nimba and Lofa still exist as part of Liberia and then reach far into Guinea. Nobody gave that to us. It was the Loma, the Mano, the Bandi that fought to remain part of Liberia. Why Nimba and Lofa are not in Guinea today. Nobody talks about that. But we sit here today spitting on our own ancestors, our own indigenous ancestors, as we spit on the ancestors of the repatriated Africans. This is a tragedy. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share what I have learned. And I appreciate Jabari for coming and sharing what he has learned. And the reason Jabari and I are agreeing on absolutely everything is because Jabari and I read for ourselves, primary sources, and we think for ourselves, and our minds are centered in our Africanness. We're not seeing the world through the eyes of the people who conquered African people. We're seeing the world through our own eyes, and we're able to discern for ourselves. And all of you are capable of doing the same. You have to stop regurgitating, stop being the torchbearer for the narrative that destroyed us. Stop being the torchbearer for the lies and misinformation that were created to destroy Liberia. Go back to the source and find the truth for yourself.
Thank you, Carl. Let's see what is coming. Keep watching. Focus on Liberia. We have the best. Tomorrow we have on the Hours of Politics, 1 p.m. Eastern. Joseph Newman Boakai's arrest plan for Liberia explained. George Preston Lobo, he's the vice president for UP USA. That's the vice president for operations. He's going to be sitting with Mr. Anthony Sear to explain the Boakai's plan arrest. Also, on the Hour of Politics, Monday, that's November 21st at 8 p.m. Masa Duopo, she is an aspirant for the House seat in Monrovia in the Claratown area. She will be here to explain. 2023 representative aspirant for district number 14, Masa Dopo, is going to be here to sit with the political bulldog, Anthony Sie. And then on Wednesday, we're going to have Grace Conant to be here, who's going to be talking about the biggest comedy night dinner and gospel album launch. That is Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. You don't want to miss all this exciting show here at Focus on Liberia. Carl, let's conclude on Gardiner and set the stage. What we're going to hear next?
We're going to talk about Russell, our lightest skinned president in history, but he was an African. He considered himself an African man. And one of the things I like to point out is, unlike the Caribbean and Africa and other parts of the world, African Americans, that one drop rule made some of the most militant light-skinned people in history, right? So you've got like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., you've got some of the most radical African American freedom fighters. Some of the most radical African American freedom fighters have been those that could have probably passed for something other than black, but they held on to that one drop rule, and they were the torch bearers for African liberation. Russell was a radical. He was an interesting person on a personal level. There's many things we're going to talk about next week with Russell. He is or was a force to be reckoned with, and people turned against him for all the wrong reasons, but we're going to talk about that as well. And just to remind people really quickly in closing, this whole concept, there's no one group of people in Liberia called repatriated Africans or African Americans. There's no one group of people called natives. This concept that every group of indigenous people has the same story is false. It's simplistic, and it has no basis in history. Bassa, Maryland, Cape Mount, all of these coastal counties, all of the people in these coastal counties were counted as citizens of Liberia from 1847, from the time it became a republic. The counties, the coastal counties, were part of the country. The men in those counties had voting rights, just like everybody else. Also, those of us in the North and Central Territory, we didn't want any part, because we were the ones that had nations. We didn't want any part of what was going on the coast. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about Russell. We're going to talk about how the people in the Northern Central Territories of Liberia, we, the Mano, the Loma, the Northern Pele, not the Pele people on the coast, but the ones in the northern sections of the country, the Mandi, the Madingos, other than the ones that were already on the coastal counties, they didn't want to be part, because the kings already had sovereignty, and they wanted to remain somewhat independent. And so we're going to talk about that relationship. That's where that starts to really, really show its head under President Russell's term. And I want people to understand not to read history backwards. We're going in a chronological order. So we haven't gotten to the point yet where we're going to start talking about hut tax and all of the things that you guys like to hear about how your ancestors were victims of some imperialist state. That hasn't come up yet.
Oh yeah, that's going to take at least 2 or 3 presidents.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it, but we do it in chronological order as it appears in history. Yeah. So when you're asking why we're talking about wonderful things in history, is because that's where we are. This was our golden era. It's going to get bad. It's going to deteriorate pretty fast. It's going to deteriorate. And then they're going to start saying, well, why y'all cussing our presidents like that? So the point of the matter is, Liberia's history is long, and these things do unfold as time goes on, and we're going to discuss them in context. Right. But at this point, the coastal counties, the indigenous people on the coast, the Kru, the Bassa, the Grebo, the Vai, these are all Liberian citizens. So that all Liberian people didn't become citizens of that's the indigenous people. There's no one group of people called indigenous. Y'all get that out of your mind. It doesn't have a basis in history.
And if you want a brief overview on Alfred Francis Russell, I have a video on the BL Efferson channel on the Liberian Presidential Series. It's about 10 minutes long. So if you want a brief overview on his background, some letters and things that happened during his administration, make sure you go check out that. And I got some more with Hillary R.W. Johnson and Joseph James Cheevan. So that's what I have. And I am looking forward to finally getting all of that information out. So again, everybody, hope you guys learned a lot. And of course, know your history, because if you don't write it, somebody else will.
Thank you. And it's very important to mention that there is no homogeneous group. Even if you say on the coast, we're different. I come from Sino County. Sino has so many groups. In fact, some will be called bush people. And so it is not just one group. Among the crew alone, there are so many different groups. Among the Gribbles alone, sometimes we don't even understand one another. So things are not as simple as sometimes people look at them. They're a little more complicated. And if you look at a 150-year history, 170, 200-year history, come on now, you can't just paint a broad brush. Things are little more complex than we think them to be. Sometimes people say, oh, this is the best president ever, or since 1847, or this is the worst since 1847, right? So somebody made that statement, and then I asked them, what do you know about Alfred F. Russell? You know what they told me? Oh, move from there, man. Those people were not president. So it's like we don't know much, and we try to always paint a broad brush. And that's why I encourage everyone to watch the History Channel on Focus on Liberia. This is the only place you can find this kind of thing on the planet. And I think you should believe me when I say on the planet. Until then, we're going to end with our song that says, we are all Liberians. Whether you came from the Gola ethnic group, or Bassa, the Gio, the Gribble, or the crew. Whether you are for this political party or that political party, whether you believe Liberians were subjugated or not, we are all Liberians. Go ahead.
I forgot. I can't leave without forgetting this. I ain't forgot about it. I can't leave without ending it on this. Yes.
All right, Jabari. And my son born here had this flag hanging behind his room. The order is hanging there. I'm like, oh wow, patriotism #1. So yes, go Jabari from Grand Bassa County. Until then, we end with our song that says, we are all Liberians. Have a good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.